Hello, everyone, and thanks for joining us for the fourth week of CRISPRCon 2020. I'm Julie Shapiro with Keystone Policy Center. Keystone is a third-party, nonprofit, non-advocacy organization bringing together diverse perspectives on societal challenges. Keystone Policy Center is based in Keystone, Colorado, on the lands of the Ute people. We're proud to facilitate CRISPRCon's conversations on science, society, and the future of gene editing. CRISPRCon aims to highlight many perspectives and experiences, spark curiosity, build understanding, and share societal histories and contexts relevant to decisions on gene editing technologies in applications of agriculture and food, conservation, health, and more. 2020 is CRISPRCon's fourth year, and in the virtual format, we have 10 webinars and 5 themes over 2 months. Throughout the entire series, we have a broad-ranging lineup of speakers, including life scientists and social scientists, journalists, business leaders, farmers, conservationists, consumer advocates and social justice advocates, global economic development leaders, religious leaders, funders and philanthropists, and more. If you missed any of our earlier virtual sessions, we encourage you to check them out, along with prior year's programming on our CRISPRCon YouTube channel. So far this year, we've discussed gene editing in the context of race and health disparities, indigenous perspectives, storytelling and journalism, gene editing research and governance in China, and the potential for societal benefits in agriculture. Planning for this week's session was conducted in partnership with the Genetic Engineering and Society Center at North Carolina State University. Thanks to the whole GES team, and special thanks to Katie Barnhill-Dilling, Jennifer Kuzma, and Patty Mulligan. The GES team's partnership on this effort was entirely in kind. They did not receive funding from CRISPRCon or its sponsors for this event. We also want to thank our sponsors for supporting the mission of CRISPRCon and our ability to create these important conversations. Our programmatic sponsors are Corteva and United Soybean Board, and additional sponsorship for this session comes from Genus and Bayer. You can visit the virtual expo in Hopin to link to relevant past CRISPRCon content and also to learn more about this week's partners and sponsors. Let me now introduce our session theme for today. This week, CRISPRCon will explore themes of equity, environment, and agriculture. Today, we will explore how risks are defined and governed in food and agricultural systems. And on Thursday, we will explore potential intersections of equity, climate, and conservation. As we'll hear today, societal concerns regarding gene-edited food and agriculture products are wide-ranging. The assessment and management of various potential risks is distributed among regulators, researchers and developers, and other societal actors. Questions of who defines what risks and concerns are managed, who manages them, and to what standard represent equity and political concerns in the risk governance process. This panel today will consider the scope and governance of different categories of risks and concerns, including how they are currently addressed and how they might alternatively be addressed through regulatory and other processes. We hope that the dialogue will bring out lots of lively discussion and debate among panelists and participants. If you're joining us via Hopin, please use the stage chat on the right-hand side of your screen to submit questions for the panelists at any time. Divergence and disagreement are welcome. Please be empathetic, curious, engaged, and respectful as you listen and share across various perspectives. At noon Eastern, after our panel session, we will transition into Ideas Marketplace sessions for small group discussions, and we hope you'll stick around and participate in those as well. So at this time, I'd like to invite our moderator and the panelists to join me on stage. I'll ask each of them to share their audio and video as I begin to introduce them briefly, and we'll hear more from each of our panelists on their background throughout the conversation. Detailed biographies of each of our panelists and our moderator are available at our CRISPRCon website. So our moderator is Jennifer Kuzma, the Goodnight NC GSK Foundation Distinguished Professor in the School of Public and International Affairs and co-director of the Genetic Engineering and Society Center at North Carolina State University. Welcome, Jennifer.
Thank you.
Sarah Gallo is Director of Market Access for Food and Farm Innovation at the Biotechnology Innovation Organization. Welcome, Sarah. Greg Jaffe is Director of the Project on Biotechnology for the Center for Science in the Public Interest. Welcome, Greg. Salim Lawafi is a social scientist and Assistant Deputy Director of Genetic Improvement and Plant Adaptation Research at CIRAD, the French Center for Agricultural Research for Development. Hello, Salim. And finally, welcome to Eliane Ubalijaro, who's a Deputy Executive Director for Programs at Global Open Data in Agriculture and Nutrition. And I'll now be removing myself from the screen so that Eliane can come on. And I'll be turning things over to Jennifer to walk us through a panel on gene editing governance in food and agriculture. Thank you.
Wonderful. Well, thank you so much, Julie. First, I want to thank Keystone, Julie, and all the staff for putting CRISPR-Con on under extremely challenging and difficult circumstances. They've really done a fabulous job, and the conversations over the last several weeks have been stellar. So I attended the first CRISPR-Con and moderated a panel there, and so it's an honor and privilege to be back to do so again. I also want to thank all of you for attending this important event. This topic for today, as you heard from Julie, is risk governance of gene-edited food, and in particular, the intersections of safety and equity. The panelists and I thought it would be important to first define a couple of terms for our panel today, and the first being governance. So I'd like you to consider a definition of governance that includes all types of watchful and responsible care throughout the life cycle of a gene-edited product. For example, all the way from conception and the anticipation of risks or benefits or other societal impacts to the downstream stages of consumer decision-making, monitoring, and it includes regulation, but it's not limited to that, in that these processes can be voluntary ones, data sharing, corporate social responsibility, and all other types of ways that we watchfully and responsibly care for emerging technologies. Whereas governance may be more narrow in the fact that it is usually based on legal, formal mechanisms that are administered by government agencies, and those might consider particular risks or harms under various statutes. So we just thought we would define those two terms, so then we switch back and forth from them. The audience may at least know what our definition entails. So with hundreds of gene-edited plants in development and gene-edited foods, and several that have cleared regulatory agencies, it's a particularly important time to consider risk governance and how well we're poised to watchfully and responsibly care for these products as they move through and enter society. So let's start with the panel discussion. First, before we get into the questions that we've prepared, I'd like to let you know that we are taking audience questions in the chat, and we will begin to select from those questions as the panel progresses. But first, to open, I'd like each of you to tell us a little bit about yourselves and your work on issues of gene editing and governance. So let's start with Eliane.
Okay. So I'm Eliane Ubalijaro. I'm based in Canada and Montreal, where I work for Global Open Data in Agriculture and Nutrition. And so my interest is in the work I do. We are looking at how data can help empower the 820 million people who go hungry every day and the 2.7 billion who live in food insecurity. And so how does data influence their capacity to be empowered in terms of what they do? And so I'm currently, I'm a molecular geneticist by training, and I've worked in the biotechnology industry. I've advised governments. I've worked in the sustainability field. And I'm currently preparing a report for FAO on legal and policy analysis of ownership and control of agricultural data. So this is, and so within my work, I see what's happening in terms of CRISPR and gene editing as an important part of the knowledge base that is being accessible and usable in agriculture that affects the livelihoods of smallholder farmers.
Wonderful. Thank you. Salim?
Hi, thank you, Jennifer. My name is Salim Louafi. I'm based in CIRAD in Montpellier, south of France. And I'm the Assistant Deputy Director of the research unit that is mainly composed of biologists and geneticists, and that deals with genetic improvement and adaptation of tropical plant and Mediterranean plants. And we work a lot in collaboration with developing countries. And I'm a social scientist there, and my main interest is on global governance of agrobiodiversity, and more specifically on science-policy interface. How policy impacts science and the conduct of science, collaboration and production of science, but also how science has an impact on the dynamic of global policy discussion on agrobiodiversity and biotechnology. And before joining CIRAD, I used to work as a senior officer at the Secretariat of the International Treaty on Genetic Resources for Food and Agriculture in Rome, in FAO, the UN Organization for Food and Agriculture. And I'm also a member of the Economic, Ethical, and Social Committee of the French High Council on Biotechnology, which is an independent body in charge of advising the French government on biotechnology issues. So I took part to some discussion there with different stakeholders on issue of genome editing. And I was also part of the first of the team of the first external evaluation of the International Platform on Biodiversity and Ecosystem Services, IPBES. Thank you.
Wonderful, thank you. Greg.
Hi, I'm Greg Jaffe. I'm the director of the Biotechnology Project at the Center for Science and Public Interest. My background is an undergraduate degree in biology, and I'm also a lawyer. I've been an environmental lawyer my whole life. I've worked inside the government and also at CSPI. CSPI is a nonprofit consumer group located in Washington, D.C. We work on food and nutrition issues. We try to advocate and educate based on the best available science out there. We take no funds from corporations and never have in our 50 years plus of existence, nor any grants from the federal government. And we do that to sort of keep our independence and to prevent any conflicts of interest. As I said, I run the Biotechnology Project, which works on issues around genetic engineering, gene editing, cloned animals, cell cultured meat, and other new and emerging food and agricultural technologies. And you know, what we work on is trying to figure out how are we going to ensure the safety of these products, but also provide information to consumers so that society can get the benefits from these products while minimizing the risks of these products. So when you mentioned the definition of governance, and think of it as regulation plus. And so I come to this issue working a lot on the regulation, on the laws and regulations that are done to ensure safety of products. That's a minimum for commercial entry. But we also work at issues around the broader governance, around engagement, around transparency, around stewardship, because it's not just about safety, but also building trust and having information so that people want to purchase these products and we can get those benefits.
Wonderful. Thank you, Greg. Sarah.
Hi, good morning. Thank you. My name is Sarah Gallo. I'm the Director of Market Access for Food and Farm Innovation at the Biotechnology Innovation Organization. At BIO, our members are working at the intersection of biology and technology across organisms, plants, animals, and microbial applications in a variety of technology platforms, all focused on bringing beneficial products to the marketplace, similar to what Greg just said. My work as the Director of Market Access is really founded on the principle that innovation flourishes when science and consumer values are aligned and they complement one another. We know at BIO that the U.S. regulatory approach can't exist in isolation. So what my work at BIO is focused on is really developing a proactive approach to transparency in order to build trust and foster an inclusive environment where we can work together to solve some of society's most pressing challenges, whether that is on the nutritional side or the environmental side or on the climate. Our members understand that consumers want to know more information about innovative biotechnologies like gene editing. They want to know what's in their food, and they want to know whether their food is safe. Our members and our work is really committed to be a driver of that endeavor, and I look forward to talking about a number of those issues today. So thank you for the invitation to be here.
Great. Well, as you all can tell, we have a stellar panel representing different countries and different areas of expertise and perspectives on governance. So the first question, we'll hit you with an easy one, which is a joke. In understanding the landscape of risk governance, what do you consider to be the biggest risks or societal impacts that we should worry about with gene-edited foods or other gene-edited agricultural products? And I'll leave it open to whoever wants to go first this time.
I was just talking, so I'm happy to talk.
Okay, Sarah, go ahead.
So I can kick it off.
Sure.
I think fundamentally we know that no single company or association is going to accomplish the goal of building trust that enables the innovation to be accepted into the marketplace. So my biggest, as I think about the biggest risks that exist, my biggest concern is that we're not going to achieve the level of trust that's needed to build a successful and beneficial innovation ecosystem. I think there are a few important factors that go into that, and I know, Jennifer, you're prepared to guide us through a conversation about those today. We're here today talking about gene editing, but I think when we're talking about trust and risk of trust, it really goes beyond that, and how we need to build trust for the future, thinking about those technology platforms that are yet to come. Bio's been fortunate to hold a series of convening events that happened in person last year, of course, and virtually this year. And one of the big issues that comes forward, and I think it's directly related to that trust ecosystem, is that it's not acceptable to hide information or have the perception of hiding information from consumers. That's something that we really need to focus on, and that's going to be critical to having that trust-based ecosystem. We're also going to need to think about how we look at participation from a variety of companies working on a variety of plants, animals, and microbial products across a variety of geographies, which I know my colleagues on the panel today are better equipped to talk about than I am. And lastly, I just wanted to touch on the fact that we really should be thinking about trust and transparency as a whole value chain activity. So certainly, as the representative of the technology developers here today, we have a big part to play in that. But if we're really going to foster trust and tackle that risk, then we should be thinking collectively about how we all play a part in that conversation.
So I'll jump in there here, Jennifer. Although I am going to push back on you on your question in two ways. First, I don't want to clarify things as the biggest risk. I think there are lots of ones out there, and so I'm going to talk about three of them, but I'm not going to say that these are the biggest or the most important. I don't think we have enough evidence or data to suggest any of those yet. And the second one is, I'm going to push back a little bit, that I'm going to consider these potential risks. So most of these products are not out there yet, so we don't know what they're going to be. And so we're talking about potential risks, and potential means that they may not actually materialize. So we're hypothesizing here. And so the three that I'm going to talk about are, I think from a consumer perspective, the biggest issue for consumers is safety. Consumers want to know that if they purchase a product at the store, that product is safe to eat, whether that's safe for their family, safe for their kids. And with any new technology, consumers worry about that issue and want an independent assessment that will alleviate those concerns. So whether or not there really is a food safety risk, when there's something new out there in the food supply, people are concerned, is this safe? And want to be satisfied with scientific data that is the case. The second risk I want to talk about is, when you start growing products outdoors, which we are talking about in an agricultural context, there's always going to be environmental concerns. How is this going to interact with the rest of the environment out there, the agricultural environment and the non-agricultural environment? Will it negatively affect species we care about? Will there be ecological issues associated with it? And the third issue the risk I wanted to talk about is the risk that if we don't get the regulation and governance to have the proper balance, that we could lose the use of this technology for societal benefits. So I think we've heard in other CRISPR-Con in the earlier weeks that there could be this technology could be used to address climate change, to address the constraints that prevent farmers from achieving the most that they can from their land, from their crops, from their animals. But we might not achieve that if, as Sarah mentions, we have a trust issue. And so to me, there's a risk that if we don't get the balance correct, the balance in regulation, the balance in governance, the balance in trust, that we might not achieve those. So I wanted to raise those three of what I think are many potential risks that are out there.
Great, thank you. Salim or Eliane, do you want to jump in? Maybe from a EU perspective, or trust, or other types of concerns that we haven't covered yet?
Well, one of the concerns that just came up just listening to Gregory, was this idea of will this increase the asymmetry in terms of the global north and the global south in terms of knowledge that allows production of more food to feed local populations? Will the traits being looked at have an influence on important traits that are important for climate change and for smallholder farmers? Smallholder farmers still feed 75% of the world's population. And so how is that benefiting the smallholder farmers in the world? And how is that being articulated in terms of the products that are coming to market or not? And how is that giving them more freedom in terms of the choices they have, or locking them into partnerships that may decrease their freedom?
Salim, I'd like to hear your perspective on this wide range of concerns, all the way from the risks of loss benefits to food safety and trust, and how well we're doing managing those, either at the global level or EU level or other country level. How well do you think we're doing on either regulating the safety concerns or managing these other types of concerns?
Yeah, thank you, Jennifer. It's true that for me, I wouldn't answer from a kind of a substantive point of view on one category of risk, but more on the procedural dimension. And for me, the biggest risk would be to maintain a kind of institutional void, in the sense of a lack of agreed structures and rules on how to gene editing should be governed beyond even the risk dimensions. And here we have to recognize that there is still a lot of discontent regarding the lack of perceived authority of the regulatory agency in terms that would be seen as trustworthy, and which decision is based on a full and open and transparent discussion. And I mean, there is a lot of hype around gene editing, and the recent Nobel Prize will likely reinforce this. And obviously with that comes a lot of promotion of expectations, which is a common feature in the development of science and technology projects, with enormous economic and social benefits that are being promised, and advances that are also presented as really radical breakthrough, far-reaching in the way in their application, and also revolutionary in their consequences. So this way of presenting things, I think, adds to the confusion and this lack of perceived authority, because it's hard to understand how something that is presented as so revolutionary could escape from any kind of societal and governmental oversight. So I think the challenge for me is to find scientific and political institutions capable of initiating the forms of deliberation that is required by this new technology, which means the ability to integrate multiple perspectives and multiple point of view. And for now, at what we can see, it's quite hard to move away from a very polarized discussion. So I think the challenge is still ahead of us on this matter.
Mm-hmm. So how do we do that? I'm wondering if any of the panelists have, I'm hearing some ideas about better participation. So one question is how are the levels of current participation, public participation, in either regulatory decisions or broader governance decisions in your country or in the domain that you're working in? And what suggestions do you have for improving that?
So I really appreciate the efforts made by the Convention on Biodiversity in terms of having an Africa group look at sequence data, look at gene editing, look at genetic data, and how does that work in terms of regulatory frameworks in the developing world, and how do we look at indigenous knowledge in this framework, and how to make sure that there is enough awareness and knowledge for local decision makers to have fact-based decision-making happening. And I think it's really important to ensure that the availability of knowledge information to ensure that proper frameworks are in place. And so that's one of the elements that I see that is really important. And in that perspective, also the work that's being done by the FAO is really important in terms of access to seeds. So these are the kind of things that I find are really critical.
And Greg, what about at the U.S. Excellent perspective, Eliane. And Greg, what about at the U.S. level? How well are we doing with that, either in regulatory systems or in governance?
Well, I mean, I think public participation and regulation in the U.S. is a mixed bag. I think we've gotten better at it over the years, and we continue to get better at it. But I think we still have a ways to go. And so, historically, public participation has only been the period where somebody could write a written comment to an agency. And that works, and it provides a number of stakeholders. And I think that the agencies get a broad perspective of the positions out there on different issues through that. But, agencies have gotten better. I just saw a traceability proposal that just went out from FDA, and they are required to have 3 virtual hearings. I mean, they would have had those hearings in public. And so they're required as part of their record to have 3 hearings. And agencies we see are doing more hearings. And a lot of those hearings are being held outside of the United States. We've seen hearings that the USDA has done in other places in the country to try to get farmers, whether that's in Sacramento, California, or in the Midwest. So there's been some movement outside, and the hearings and meetings that they're doing are more discussion oriented. It's not just get up and make a presentation, but the agency listens as people around a table have conversations and takes notes about that, and that adds to their knowledge. So we've seen some ways that they have begun to make an effort to broaden the perspectives that they get. The final comment I'd say is, we've seen also, dockets with 200,000-300,000 comments submitted. The U.S. bioengineered disclosure rule had thousands of comments from individuals. So, in the past, historically, comments have primarily come in from stakeholders. Let's call them NGO groups like myself, or trade associations like Sarah's group and others, who I do think represent a lot of different perspectives out there. But they didn't get them from average citizens, and we've seen more of that. Could we do more on all of that? Sure. There's always an off play about time and money and getting to a decision. The one thing I would say is, I think the regulatory environment is narrow. I mean, the questions that agencies look at are primarily questions of safety. And many of the comments that come in are broader questions about, as Salim gets to, should we use these technologies, and what are the broad impacts of those? And we have a good mechanism to have a discussion about those at the policy level. We are good at saying this particular product is safe or that particular product is safe, but we don't look at, well, if we move into this space of having all these products, on the landscape, what will be the impacts of those? It's not fair to have them, those impacts be delegated to one particular product, because it's going to be caused by the range of products. But we don't have a good mechanism, and I think so. The public, I think, gets frustrated with the regulatory public comment process because a lot of their concerns aren't things that are really relevant to the statutes.
So Jennifer, if I can, and
sure, please.
Particularly when we're thinking about some of the new regulations that have come out of USDA recently with regard to biotechnology and plants. I think one of the things that I would point out is it's also incumbent upon us as industry and working together, if we have commonalities and things that we're concerned about, to really elevate those so that the perspective is coming from a diverse set of stakeholders. And Greg and I were able to work together on something like that under the umbrella of USDA's regulation. So I think one thing that could benefit the regulatory system is if these traditionally disparate actors are coming together and coming forward with an important idea for the technology to flourish, that we're doing that collectively. And then, as in the case that happened on this issue, if that suggestion or recommendation is not adopted by the regulatory system, how do we still continue to push forward with that idea? So I think that kind of spans between what we're getting out of the regulatory system, but what we know the marketplace or what actors and stakeholders are demanding. So how are we taking that information and that collective effort and pushing it forward, even if we don't get what we want from the regulatory system? And I think that's going to be really important as well.
So I can refer here to, in France, I think the idea of having something more inclusive approach of regulation as something deliberative, a learning process that improves also anticipation and reflect on the diversity of societal values, needs, and concern that could take several forms, and in France, we had that kind of the chance to have this establishment in 2008, if I'm not wrong, of this High Council on Biotech, which has two different sub-bodies. One, the Scientific Council, and one which is this Committee on Economic, Ethical, and Society, which is composed mainly of different stakeholder group, almost 30 different groups. And there we had a chance to have for 2 years a long deliberation, and it was even before the decision of the European Court of Justice about the regulation of gene editing products. And it's true that within that committee, we have been able to discuss issues which are generally hidden dimension on the controversy that, and for which and beyond the usual disciplines that are usually mobilized to deal with the subject. So it was a major step forward, I think, in terms of creating a new public space and address issues that are usually not addressed, like impact of intellectual property, the diversity of production model, traceability issues, equity. But it was also a mixed kind of outcome, because, as I said, at the same time, there was another body discussing on, let's say, real stuff, the scientific, what is seen as the only scientific valid dimension, which is the genetic dimension, and with a risk-based approach, with a probabilistic style of reasoning about those risks, and that was seen as the legitimate the legitimate voice of for the regulatory body, and whatever we have discussed and done in this other council was seen more as a kind of add-on, a commentary to that kind of truth that was coming out of this other committee. So there was still a huge asymmetry in terms of power and capacity to influence the decision. And I think that echoes something probably where science as an institution, as an organization, should weigh in and try to also do its part of the job by refusing, or at least allowing more a diversity of discipline to and views and styles of reasoning and approaches and level of observation. So all that diversity, which is contained within scientific organization, are usually not really, at least those scientific organizations tend to align more easily to the usual expertise that is requested from them on those topics, rather than trying to introduce within their own kind of organization this the democratic and more open discussion. And that's, I think, something that is something to work on. Like more democracy in science.
Just to pick up on what Salim just said, as a member of the African Academy of Sciences, the members will comment on different issues to support policymaking. And one of the efforts that is being made within the Academy is how do we bring the experts in technology as well as social scientists to reflect together so that we actually have transdisciplinary commentary that can be more useful to policymakers, that looks at different lenses. So that's, I think that's really something that needs to be made more, so that there isn't more power driven on one side, that is the technology that can bring profit, but also look at the other consequences in terms of human capital, social capital, and natural capital, and the effects on those. That's wonderful.
Sarah, do you think a process such as that Eliane just described would increase trust, which you identified as kind of the number one risk?
I do, and I appreciate those comments. I think, as we've thought about the voices that need to be in the conversation, I think there's been a real pause and realization by industry that this isn't just about the kinds of scientists that are represented here today, and that we only stand to benefit from more of those ideas and that diversity of perspectives being included when we're thinking about putting technology into the marketplace, or really answering the question, like you said, around the why are we using the technology. Those are all legitimate, consistent questions that we're hearing. I think information is more widely available to consumers now than it was when transgenic technology started coming into the marketplace. So it's only logical that there's going to be a diversity of questions and a diversity of perspectives facing us as industry as we look to put these beneficial technologies into the marketplace. So certainly appreciate that, and I think it's something that Bio has also tried to really be conscious of doing at our own convening events, is not just take the plant biologists or the molecular biologists or the marine biologists and put them on a panel, but really start expanding the disciplines that are represented in our conversations, and use that as a model for other industries. So thank you for that.
Greg, I think we're still faced with the challenge, though, that a lot of our formal decision making, kind of where the rubber hits the road on a go, no-go decision, is limited by particular statutes on what we can, what types of risk we can consider, even whether benefits are considered, which I'd love to hear more about as well from each of you. But so we're limited by these statutes, but yet there's this desire to broaden these inclusive and participatory processes and bring in a more diverse set of disciplines. So can you comment on that tension a bit, and maybe what are we limited to in regulatory decisions for current gene edited foods, and perhaps where might that tension exist when it comes to the uncertainty of the potential risks or societal implications?
Thank you, Jennifer. Yes, you're correct. I mean, the reality is that, in most countries, and I'm going to talk about the United States, but we have legislatures, and legislatures pass laws, and those laws are implemented through the executive branch, through different agencies. And those laws are fairly specific about what the agencies are supposed to do. And so most of those laws that we're talking about here are laws to protect, human and animal health, or to protect the environment. And those are what we call the safety issues. And so the agencies are really limited in making a determination as to whether a particular product that's before them is safe, whether it's safe to eat, safe for animals, or safe for the environment. And so there may be other issues about social, equity issues. There may be issues about, how this is going to change the landscape of rural America, things like that. Those are important issues. But from the agency's point of view, they're very limited in looking at a science risk assessment based view of looking at, is this product safe? And I'm first one to say that that's really important. I think that's almost the sort of entry point, in my perspective from CSPI is, if it's not safe to eat, we can't talk about societal benefits or all kinds of other things. That's sort of the minimum standard. We first got to meet that safety issue before we can even talk about whether it's going to benefit climate change or other type of things. Because it might have great benefit for climate change, but if it's also going to put people in the hospital, I'm not going to support that. And I don't think that the agencies want that, or the public wants that, and somebody to make an assessment of whether the benefits of climate change outweigh the fact that some people are going to get allergenic reactions and go into the hospital for something. So I think there's a role for agencies to play. What I see in the public comment period and other things is when people have these other concerns, when there's no other forum for them, they come into the public participation. They come in by the back door. So people may say that a genetically engineered animal is unsafe. They really don't have evidence of it being unsafe, but they're uncomfortable of it for ethical reasons, or for social reasons, or because it's not going to be labeled and it isn't transparent and they can't choose whether to buy it in the marketplace. And so in some ways that all comes in, which makes the regulators' job difficult, because they have to say no to those people. I'm not going to consider your point of view because they're limited in what they can do. And so then people lose credit. Then in some ways, the regulatory agencies lose credibility. So I've been one who's advocated that we should keep the regulation and those decisions very science-based, risk-based in one part of the government, and then we should have other parts of the government, committees like Salim's talking about, or other places where we can have these broader policy discussions, which I think, policymakers and the public can make, and we can bring in lots of other people. But it's, I'll give one example. The question is the genetically engineered or gene edited animal safe? That's a safety question. Do we want to do this because of ethical reasons or human animal welfare reasons or other things are completely different issues. And so we have to separate those. If we bring them together, then everything loses credibility, because the regulatory system is making decisions that people don't know. Are you basing it on science? Are you basing it on an ethical viewpoint or something else?
Salim? Please.
Yeah, can I react on that? Because I'm not sure that I share this view that, this kind of, how you say that in English, sorry. Anyway, this, the science-based argument, I think I have some difficulties with that, because science is not a monolithic. We have plenty of example of how science can be strategically used for justifying preformed decisions in the political arena, and or ignore if it run against the interest of some political decision. So, but beyond even this kind of cynical perspective about the use of science, just from a more ontological perspective, science, calling upon science-based decision give the wrong impression that there is one unified science able to deliver the truth. And this ignores the fact that there are multiple science discipline, multiple reasoning style, multiple level of observation, multiple time horizons on which to build evidence, and about the very same issue. So I'm afraid that when we say science-based, we reinforce this idea that we see only the genetic dimension and the safety issue related to that as the only legitimate science able to provide sound advice, sound evidence. Whereas for me, we can do sound science on the impact of intellectual property rights. We can do sound science on equity issue. We can do sound science and build evidence on other dimensions that are not necessarily as, should be pushed to something that is value-laden and not objective in the way that we conceive the genetic aspect and the risk assessment dimension. So I really feel strongly about that, the need to build a more pluralistic view about science and how science could contribute to this discussion.
Salim, I hope I wasn't misunderstood. I'm not suggesting at all that you can't use science to address many of those other questions that you're suggesting. I think there's lots of very good science out there that can be used to address those questions, but many of those questions aren't what the regulators are asked to do. The regulator is asked at FDA is to determine if this is safe to eat, and that should be a science-based decision, whether or not it's safe to eat. Sure. And I do believe there's good science out there to determine if something is safe to eat. And I think that that's really needed for consumers and others. But there are, don't get me wrong, that there isn't lots of other science, and that science doesn't deal with social or other kinds of
Sarah
issues.
Yeah, go ahead, Sarah.
No, as you say, certainly from an industry perspective, that science-based, risk-appropriate regulatory agenda in the United States is critical to our members. As Greg said, we really count on that government assessment and that strong regulatory approach that's science-based and risk-appropriate for our membership as well. I think, certainly when you look at what USDA has done and their modernized regulatory approach, that's reflective of decades of science. And we want to make sure that we're being forward about that, and that the legitimacy of those science-based regulations is something that the public understands. I do agree that there's a need to have conversations and to have evidence-based discussions around some of those other issues, but for us, that keeping the government as a science and risk appropriate arbiter of the technology is critical for the predictability, for investment, and for a number of aspects that our companies are looking at.
Great. So I'm a member of the Society for Risk Analysis, and sometimes even members of that society say risk assessment is more an art than a science. And, you know, sometimes setting your endpoints, what you care about is value laden for what endpoints you're looking at. Where you draw the line for a standard is value laden. So I think this is a great discussion about kind of the intersection of science and values, and is there a dichotomy? And Eliane, you talked about the process that you were using to bring the two together. And so I'm wondering if you have any comments about this area as well.
Well, the issue of values is a really important one. And for me, it really comes down to, what are we using science for? Are we using it to increase profit of corporations? Or are we using it for the betterment of society, the betterment of humanity, for fighting climate change, for increasing biodiversity in the world? And so part of it is, what is it we value and who shapes what we value? And so who's doing the research towards the types of products that are coming to market, and who will they benefit in priority? And so part of it is, how do we have science serve the greater good? Because there's so many ways technology can exist for technology itself, but that does not necessarily mean that the value of human dignity is being considered in terms of what is being brought to market, and how that actually helps solve the big challenges of how do we feed a growing population that is facing, with COVID, a lot of issues related to access to food, especially in the global South. So for me, it's really, how do we have science align with values of shared interconnectedness on the planet, and how who we are, what we do affects everything, affects nature, affects biodiversity, affects the safety of all our systems, and what are the risks we're willing to take to use technology in ways that are clearly able to increase profit, but how do we ensure that they're increasing social good at the same time?
Which kind of is a lead into one of the other questions we had on our list, was about benefits, and should benefits be considered in a formal regulatory process? Certainly they're considered in a broader, or should be considered in a broader governance process, but what about regulatory statutes and risk benefits? Some of them, at least in the US, you can include benefits, some not. And so does anyone else have a comment on that, in the social good nature of different gene edited products, and whether that should be a part of regulatory affairs?
Well, at Bio, as I said, when we think about the regulatory system, we are thinking about those science-based safety stewardship questions that we've talked about. I think the question around benefits, thinking about in a couple ways. One is, if there's a desire to have an independent verification of benefits of the technology, so that it's not just industry coming forward and saying this product is good for these reasons, and that there's a desire by others to say, we'd like to have that checked out, whether those benefits are potential because the product is still in development, or real. That's a conversation that we're willing to have. And I think that that's come up a number of times in our stakeholder engagement. And it's something that Bio and its members are anxious to talk about. I also think, as far as benefits goes, when we're talking about, how important it is to talk about the benefits of the technology, whether that's for, nutritional reasons, or sustainability reasons, or animal welfare reasons, that we've actually taken and developed a number of platforms to have that benefits-driven conversation, where there could be a dialogue and there could be a diversity of perspectives involved, sort of tangential to those more scientific regulatory questions. We've launched a project called Innovature that is strictly dedicated to talking about the benefits of gene editing in food and agriculture across our planet, our health, and our environment. We have our own Growing Trust and Innovation web hub, where we're having a benefits-driven conversation and talking about things around transparency. So I do think it's critical that we're coming together to have these benefits focused, and definitely welcome more conversation about how we could have those benefits be verified and build more trust around understanding what those benefits are and who's receiving the benefit? Is it just a farmer? Is it a company? Or is it vulnerable populations? Is it the environment? I think those are all going to be really important to have an open dialogue about.
Jennifer, I would agree with you that, our regulatory system, some of our statutes do allow benefits to be addressed out. And, in the environmental area in particular, we generally look at a cost benefit analysis and we look at the benefits. And that makes a lot of sense because, when we're substituting, if we're deciding, do we approve this pesticide, this new pesticide, we have to look at, well, how does it compare to what the farmers are currently doing? And will it be less harmful to some insects than the current pesticide that it's going to replace? And so that should factor into the conversation. And so I think there are lots of places where it's very important because, the environment's constantly changing. And so you can't just look at what the safety of it is, you also have to look at what the benefits are. That is harder in areas of food, where I think that, we're not very comfortable with our government deciding, well, there's this nutritional benefit, but there's this allergenicity harm, and we're going to offplay, number of people in hospitals versus number of people extended life because of less heart disease or something like that. And so I think in some of our statutes, we do have sort of a safety. We first achieve some level of safety before we look at benefits into an analysis. And I think in some cases that is correct way to do it. But that's different than talking, as Sarah said, about still looking at those societal benefits and having a decision. Just because a product's safe doesn't mean it should move forward onto the market. And so should those go onto the market, and what are the benefits, and which products should we, I think as Eliana said, how do we figure out from the beginning, when we're in the development stage, which are the products that are really going to help the greater good, and how do we get those to be the ones, how do we get those to be the kind of things that the technology moves forward with?
Great. Go ahead, Salim. And then after this, we're going to move to some audience questions.
Yeah,
Salim or Aliane, if you have comments on this.
Yeah, no, just to reflect on that, because I also chaired the working group in this High Council on biotech on socioeconomic impact. And the very first question that we have put in our kind of grid of analysis on socioeconomic impact was really this question of the benefits, and by asking why we need to be more explicit about why we need it in the first place, such a technology to address what kind of issue, and it's not because something is feasible that is desirable. So I think it's very important to think about that, and not just, and also wonder whether this technology is the best way to achieve that particular goal also, because that's what are the alternative solutions that may exist to address this particular problem that genome editing could help resolving. So I think those kind of opening up the field of possible solution is really important also, even as a way to build trust and transparency, I think. So yeah, that's so I really think that this ethical question about the direction and the objective that are pursued behind this the mobilization of such technology should be addressed, and unfortunately this is
and along go ahead, Eliane.
Yeah, just to build on what Salim was saying, because one of the issues is what are we spending money in terms of R&D versus what are the urgent needs? And so I think about the issue of pesticide, genes related to pesticide resistance. And so not only, okay, if we put them in, are we sure that it's not affecting other locations in the genome? And, what are there any risks to be transmitted to wild relatives that can actually change biodiversity? And then the alternatives is, what would be the cost to shifting to regenerative agriculture, where we would have diverse crops growing together and having constant cover that would limit the weeds? And so there are different ways of going about it that would actually promote biodiversity preservation, produce safer foods that would not require so much chemical input. And so the tension is, where are we using to use technology for the greater good? And does it make sense to push technologies that are viable in economically sense in terms of large farmers that have purchasing power to buy these and make it easy for them to work in monocrops and ways that they can produce large quantities of the same foods, which is needed. At the same time, for the 570 million smallholder farmers in the world, what do they need, and are there ways for them to benefit from these technologies in ways that really serve their needs in terms of feeding their own families and also in being able to access markets and improve their livelihoods? So for me, those are the tensions involved in terms of large market economies versus smallholder farmer-based economies, you know, in the sense that they still feed 75% of the planet. So they are important, even though economically they do not have the same power that large corporations hold.
And actually, we have a question from the audience along those lines too, that any of you, it's directed at Eliane, but any of you could respond to it. It says, at this point, genome engineering has focused on economically viable crops that often don't reflect the needs of smallholder or the cultural values of smallholder farmers. So how do conversations on regulation that focus and empower products produced by large agribusiness translate to underrepresented groups that traditionally have not been invited to the table? So I guess looking at this intersection between regulation and the empowerment of certain products, and are they meeting the needs of all types of farmers? Any comments on that?
No, go ahead.
Go ahead,
Well,
Celine.
Sorry. Yeah. Well, no. So I fully agree, and along the line that Eliane has already talked about, I think one of the highest risks that in the current incentive structure from a global perspective and this rewarding system of innovation, it's clear that we can expect that innovation derived from gene editing will mainly serve the need of those who are probably already overfed. And hence, I would say, increase food waste and obesity, all kind of issues that are the hidden cost of this kind of food production system. So rather than tackling, again, from a global perspective, the real food security issue faced by the poorest and the people who need more food. So it's very important also to have some capacity to act on the incentive structure to be able to direct those innovation to those underserved needs. And that also goes along with this issue of more democracy in the way science is conducted and in the way partnership is built with developing country and with research system in the
I would just
South,
note that
South.
from a biotechnology industry perspective, where we're seeing growth in our membership and where some of the newer companies that are coming to the table or that we're participating with in different venues are working in crops that traditionally, were not seen with the original transgenic technologies. We have companies that are working primarily in the tropics, that are trying to tackle crops that are highly susceptible to climate change. So I would say that there is a shift happening as far as it's not just a few big companies working in a few small crops, and that we are seeing a greater diversity both of the size and scale of the players, but more importantly, I think in the organisms that they're working on across plants and animals and microbes. The other thing that I would say is just on the issue of equity and how we talk about that. I think we have a new CEO at Bio, Dr. Michelle McMurray-Heath, and she said some very, very powerful things around science and justice, and it's a pillar of her platform at Bio moving forward, and really understanding that access to science is the definition of justice. So when we think about what it means for, farmers across the globe or a variety of actors have access to this technology, we really are thinking about it through that equity and justice lens. And I think you'll see, an embracing of more of those smaller companies and more of those diverse companies that are really working on not just the traditional crops that we're used to when we think about biotechnology, but ones that are going to have a direct relationship to people's access to food and economic well-being.
So another question from the audience, it actually relates to a question on our list that we haven't gotten to quite yet is, and maybe we'll take both of these at the same time and maybe starting with Greg to respond. Is there anything different for the governance of gene edited crops in compared to conventionally bred crops or to first generation transgenics? And when discussing those risks, is anybody raising awareness about the risks of conventionally bred crops? So kind of now moving a little bit to the comparison of all these issues, safety, equity, governance, in the context of the comparators, either the baseline of conventional crops or the first generation of transgenics. So Greg, do you want to start us off with a response to that?
Sure, I will do that. And some people may think my answer might be a little controversial, but I mean, I think, so there are some, obviously everybody knows the characteristics of gene editing that could make governance different than it would be for these other things. Than GMOs, it's more precise, it's easier to do, it's cheaper to do, so many more companies will be doing it. And so in some sense that might make governance more difficult, it might make it easier, I don't know. When I look at regulation of any product, and so I'm not limiting this to GMOs or gene editing or conventional crops, the reason to regulate is, the question is, are there potential risks, and are there potential risks that regulation would be able to manage? And so so that same question, so people have applied that to GM crops, they could apply that to gene edited crops, they also could apply that to conventional crops. So I think the problem with the debate that's gone on is people want to put gene edited crops or gene edited products in the category of either a GM or conventionally bred. And they want to say that, well, we haven't regulated conventionally bred, or we haven't specifically regulated them in this way in the past. Well, just because we haven't done something in the past doesn't mean we should do it now. I mean, if we don't approve the pesticides we approve today are a lot safer than the pesticides we approved 20, 30, 40 years ago. Some of those products would not be approved today. We've gotten better at doing analysis of how those impact the environment. And so the question to me is not, is this more similar to conventional bred than it is to GM? The question is, are there potential risks from gene edited products? And are those risks something that we should be regulating and independent of it? And then if they are, then what would be the appropriate regulation for those? And the fact that those risks exist, I think I saw one of the comments in the stage was that, well, these, we haven't regulated conventional crops and they have risks, and that's right. And so maybe we should go back if there are conventional crops that have risks. And I see Salim, nodding there, that have caused lots of both, environmental problems or social problems or other things. Maybe we should go back and look at those. So to me, the issue isn't, do we put it in one bucket or the other bucket, but we should actually look at it indirectly as what that is. The final thing I want to say, that I don't want to take too much time, is that all gene edited products aren't the same. And so I think we have to look at regulation and this in a proportionate way. And so there are differences here. And we've had the problem in the GM technology debate and in the discussion about GM and in conventionally bred. We put everything into one bucket, and we put gene editing into one bucket. But there's lots of things. We can delete a single base pair and silence one gene, or we can make a gene drive and push a whole new phenotype into the environment beyond Mendelian genetics. And so those are very, very different. So I think we run the risk when we talk about these technologies and these products, putting them in generic things when in reality this is a technology that has many different applications. And when we come to both regulation as well as governance, we have to look at those in subsets. We can't look at them in all or nothing kind of category.
Yeah, and the issue about that is that increases the complexity of international negotiation and agreements, because then that creates subcategories that need to be looked at and may require different frameworks. And so part of it is technology is advancing at such an accelerated rate. How can we create spaces for the regulatory frameworks to advance well, but advance at a rhythm that allows us to keep up with technology? And so the issue of how technology is speeding ahead and the regulatory framework is burdened by the layers that we need to go through is a really critical one, because at the end, what happens in terms of how much is being invested to create profit versus how much is invested for good, I mean, there are choices that need to be made about how we're using these technologies and how they will contribute, and what are the risks associated with the players in terms of industry players that are coming in and making decisions on where will you have the most clear framework to be able to have a clear pathway to business. And so those are the tensions that are coming in play as the complexity of the science increases.
Sarah, Salim, any comments on the? Okay, we'll take another question from the audience, which is, what is your view, and this is for anyone, what is your view on the need to internationally harmonize the way that risk assessors approach safety of gene-edited foods? So as you may know, right now we're headed for probably another trade war. But would any of you like to comment on the need to internationally harmonize the risk assessment and safety approaches to gene-edited foods? No? Do we think it's important or not?
I mean, I'll take a try.
Okay,
I mean, I think, you know, historically, there's always been an advantage to having, you know, harmonized approaches for determining whether a product is safe, whether that's a pesticide or a gene-edited food or another type of food. I think there's advantages of if there is an international consensus that can be arised as to how to do that assessment and the data that could be needed. I think that's very beneficial. I think that's different than a harmonized approach as to whether or not those products are adopted. So I think we can come up with whether we agree of the safety of them, but that doesn't mean that everybody will have the same level of safety. Every country will have the same level of comfort with having that product, even though it is found safe. And, you know, the example, we go to the GM, in the GM area, you know, EFSA and the European Union has made the same determinations that the US has made about GM crops. Those are grown in the United States and those are not grown in Europe. So it isn't an issue of the harmonized risk assessors approach. They have harmonized how they're doing the risk assessment, but we've also given countries the flexibility and the ability politically and socially and otherwise to look at that same data, look at that other thing and say, well, we still don't want this or we want this. And so I just want to qualify the answer to that is there's one thing to come to some agreement on how to do some of the science around risk assessment, that's not necessarily harmonized in terms of everybody agreeing that this product should be on the market and adopted.
So part of my perspective on this comes from my history in working for a company that exported grain, right? So when I think kind of about the just actual value chain concerns around harmonized regulatory systems, or, you know, a consistent science-based regulatory system at some level internationally, there are real business and risk implications there, right? So if you're exporting crops and there are, you know, different regulatory systems, you know, you run the risk of a tremendous cost and loss that way, which is real for a lot of companies. Also on the animal side too, you know, if we think about moving protein around the world, that's going to be a really important thing to understand, particularly in some of those more nascent technologies that don't have 20 years worth of a regulatory system to look back on. So I think, you know, bio works really closely not only within our international team, but with the international aspects of U.S. government to make sure that you know, we're promoting a science-based and risk-appropriate regulatory system globally so that more countries do have access to the technology, whether that's from just a product perspective or just kind of fundamentally from an access to the technology perspective.
Well, and actually, we have at least a framework, which is the Cartagena Protocol, that deals with that provides that minimum level of risk assessment to allow international exchange of GMO. But the question is obviously also how to include other dimension than. And especially the social economic dimension. And there is a whole article foreseen in that protocol that is still very much not resolved, and there are a lot of tension there in terms of agreeing on a minimum issue to be considered. Whereas I think it's part of this kind of global equity to be able to put that on the table and discuss and cover those issues internationally.
I would just respond to that, Salim, and I think Eliana made this point. Eliana made this point earlier.
Yeah.
The problem with some of those Cartagena Protocol and some of those things is they move very, very slowly, and they don't really adopt the technology very well, and they're not very flexible.
Yeah.
And so, while I agree that that document is a good document and it sets a good international standard, it's a very slow process. And so these technologies are moving very, very fast. And if we want them, and so who moves fastest? Sarah's bio companies. They're the ones who move fastest. And where does the fastest move? Into the biggest markets, the ones that have the most money and the biggest. And so they leave out those smallholder farmers. They leave out other parties of small crops, other things that might be very beneficial. And so I think that's something we just have to sort of keep in mind.
Now, there's a very specific question about the Cartagena Protocol, and it says, what is the panelist's view on the uptake and proliferation of the Argentinian approach in line with the Cartagena Protocol definition of new combinations of DNA throughout Latin America? Is this indeed desirable and conducive to a level playing field? Can any of you comment on that question, or is it beyond?
I'm happy to do it. It's very much a regulatory question. So, I think the Argentinian system is one way to interpret the Cartagena Protocol's definitions. I think it is a reasonable interpretation.
Could you clarify what
others
that
might have
interpretation is for the audience, Greg, if you don't mind?
So the definition of modern biotechnology and a GMO really comes down to whether there's a novel, I forget what the words are in front of me exactly here, but a novel addition of DNA. And so the question is whether a genome edited crop that only has a deletion or a substitution is considered a novel addition, or whether the definition of the fact that you use recombinant DNA is the most telling thing. So for many definitions around the country, if you use recombinant DNA, which in most cases is what's used in gene editing, then the product could be a GMO. If you're really linking it to whether in the end the final product has a novel combination of new DNA, then some deletions or substitutions or things might not have that. They might not be considered a novel combination of that. And so they look at that question and make a decision whether or not that product is regulated as a GMO, not whether it's regulated at all, but whether it's regulated as a GMO. And so I think that is a reasonable regulatory system that they've set up for their definitions and how they've done things. That may not be what other countries are doing. The one other comment I'd have on the Argentinian regulatory system for this particular thing is it is not very transparent. So they've had many decisions that they've made and nobody can see those decisions or the data that was used to make those decisions. And so I think that's going to be problematic as we move to trade and those products getting to market. So they have a lot of products that have gone through that system that are genome edited, and they've told the researchers these are not regulated as a GMO, but they haven't alerted the public to what those are. And so to me, that's a big concern when we talk about trust and we talk about markets that they haven't done in that system.
Just kind of separate from the specific Cartagena Protocol question, it brings up some really interesting questions about just general competitiveness about the innovation ecosystem. And when we think about faults within our own regulatory system here in the US, one of the things that we point to as industry is that if the US regulatory system either can't keep pace with innovation, like we've mentioned a number of times, or is overly burdensome or isn't risk proportionate, that companies will take the technology and invest in other countries. And what are the implications there for the strength of the bioeconomy and its ability to create jobs and tackle problems if investment is constantly moving? So I think that that's just something else to think about when we look at the global landscape is if we have this very disparate landscape of regulatory systems, what are the implications there for where companies are investing and what that means for access to technology?
So we also have a question about with regard to governance and labeling and standards here today. So do you think, it's for Sarah and others though to talk about this particular issue, how will bio facilitate trust building and transparency around gene edited foods when the recent in the US National Bioengineered Food Disclosure Standard and does not necessarily include for gene edited foods?
Yeah.
And then I would just welcome comment from any of you on the labeling, traceability, and trust issues.
Yeah, thanks for that question. So certainly, as we went out and kind of asked stakeholders, and I alluded to this when I first introduced myself, kind of what those questions were. Questions we get more often than not are, is the product safe? Where is it? And how will I know where it is? And certainly, consumers having the ability to know is something that is important to bio and its members. So what we are focused on right now as part of our broader transparency initiative is really working directly with food companies and with retailers and with groups that represent consumers. Greg just spoke on a panel at our recent event that was entirely consumer focused, to really get at how can we work with industry and those groups to provide consumers with the information that they're looking for, sort of outside the scope of the law. There are a number of ways, whether that's through digital disclosure. We heard a lot of really positive comments about things like Smart Label in the United States. How can we work together to make sure that consumers can get the information that they want? So that's certainly on our radar to tackle. I think, again, there are a number of ways to get at that. Some of those can also involve partnerships with the government in promoting that, in promoting the access to information. I also think just generally when I think about labeling, oftentimes we think about that as a sort of a consequence that happens, like, oh, you have to label. And really changing the mindset about labeling or providing information via a label to really be an opportunity to educate consumers about technology. I think we know that there's a big knowledge gap around gene editing, around biotechnology and food generally. People know a little bit, but they don't necessarily know the whole picture. And our technology developers are eager to tell that story because there are some really positive attributes to some of these new technologies and the problems that they're trying to solve. So what we're doing is trying to flip the labeling conversation, and instead of it being something that we have to do, thinking about it as an opportunity to work with those important partners in the value chain to tell a positive and more holistic story about the technology.
I would just flag, Jennifer, that I think that issue is not just an issue the U.S. is going to face. There are a lot of other countries that are beginning to think about what is their regulatory system going to look like for genome edited products. They're first tackling that issue, and then their secondary issue will be whether those are labeled or disclosed, or how will information be made available to those. And again, they may choose not to. They may choose to be consistent. If they don't label it as a GMO, they also don't label it as genome edited. But they may choose to not regulate it as a genome edited product, but still label it in a similar fashion because consumers want that information, or they want to be transparent about it. So I think this is an issue that I think many countries will grapple with.
Okay. Well, we have an interesting question here, bringing us back to the issue of the intersection of science and values. So when you do bring in, the audience member asks, when one brings in ethical issues around some of these topics, how do you assure a separation of church and state? And they ask, due to the observation that some groups seem to follow dogma outside of any evidence to the contrary, and is this religion in many ways? So intersection of governance, values, and science, and religion, which we haven't talked about religion. So that's an interesting, anybody want to tackle that? I think it's an interesting question. But
Well, I think going back to what Sarah was saying earlier around trust, we started out around the issue of trust. How to create a framework of trust. There's the issue of how to create a framework of trust. How do we create a framework of dialogue so people have enough scientific understanding of what happens and the risks associated to safety? But at the same time, if we're talking about religion is politics of spirituality. So how are we bringing in the politics of spirituality and ethical values into this whole space. So it really comes down to, what is our purpose in bringing this to market? Is it to make more money? Is it to feed more people? Is it to feed more people safely? Because those are different, they're not necessarily the same thing. Is it to feed more people safely while decreasing the carbon footprint on the planet? So the complexity of the framework will increase as we add more data to the questioning. And so it's really important to create space for dialogue. Dialogue in itself creates opportunity for people to voice their concerns and to be heard. And that's one issue in itself around politics, is the desire to be heard. Or, there's something, it's like, if you exclude me, I will resist you. I don't know, there's this and this idea is, how do we create enough space for people to feel heard, for the science to be clearly shared in ways that the public understands it without jargon? And how do we ensure that we're putting in enough elements to understand what are the specific consequences of the technology to the environment and to social and human dynamics? And so how do we create that framework so that people can make really informed decisions that aren't coming out of a place of fear? And so that's where I would say would be really important.
Great. Okay, there's one question for Salim from the audience on the specifics of the HCB recently issued a notice on genome edited plants. What do you think its influence is currently worth given its history over the past decade? So moving back to more specifics, right?
Yeah, well, I will be short, but yes, indeed, the HCB, I presented the bright side of it, but I mean, obviously, it is currently in a big turmoil because there are big fight between different ministries about its fate, and people think that it has not delivered because precisely, probably because of this, I think, misdesign that I mentioned earlier. This fact of separating those two issues was probably thought as a good idea, because it has indeed created new space, but it has also shown that there was probably a kind of asymmetry that was maintained, and that has generated a lot of tensions, and that has weakened over time the ability of the HCB to conduct its work and to really have a voice in influence in any decision. So there are currently discussions in the government on how to proceed with that institution. And I don't have any information so far, but it may be, how do you say that, collapse, or I don't know. I don't have any information at this stage. We haven't met for now almost 1 year and a half.
So let's do a round robin with two final questions here. The first being, maybe in a sentence or two, how do each of you think, if you're a person, a public member, not necessarily a stakeholder or really heavily engaged in this issue, but how can you engage if you care about it? How should the public engage, or how can a person engage with this issue? So maybe starting with whoever's ready. This is an audience member question. How can a person engage?
Well, I think part of it is showing up here and listening to these types of discussions. It's important because part of it is being informed enough to make decisions that are based on facts. I think that's really important. And then to have clarity, what are the values that are important for you in terms of this technology, and what is it being used for, and does it align with your values? So part of it is, some people want cheaper food, some people want the safest food possible, and then there's tensions in between. Some people want to contribute to food systems that are ensuring that the most marginalized also have access and have dignified livelihoods. So part of it is understanding what are your value systems, and how are you engaging to ensure you have adequate facts, that you have data that reflects the science and reflects the risks, and also reflects your own desires in terms of economically, socially, humanly, and in terms of your environmental concerns, that what you're doing aligns with who you are at all those levels?
I think consumers and the public have a tremendous amount of power, and it shouldn't be underestimated, right? So your purchasing decisions, the comments you're making to food companies about your values and how that's reflected in what you want to buy, your engagement with us on social media, your engagement with my member companies on social, in a variety of ways, that's tremendously powerful. Your engagement with lawmakers, tremendously powerful. So I think, I agree. The more that you can make your voice heard in those venues, those conversations, while you as an individual might not think it matters, those collective conversations come all the way back up to the technology developers and how they look at where they're investing and the kinds of partnerships and the kinds of unique trust conversations we're going to need to have to get these innovations into the marketplace. So I would say, don't underestimate your ability to impact that.
Right. I was going to say some of what Sarah said, but I'll just add on to that, that's right. Talk to your policymakers, talk to your politicians, talk to the government, talk to scientists. If you're in the United States, what state you're in, go talk to your land grant scientists who are working on agriculture. Tell them what you think they should be done. They'll listen to you. They'll want to listen to you, and also find other stakeholder groups that align with the ideas you have and get involved in those groups. They're always looking for members and looking for people who bring a new perspective.
Salim?
Yeah, no, I won't add more. I agree that there are increasingly citizen science movement that also try to engage with the formal science organization, and I think this is also part of the kind of thing that is needed to bring also more dialogue between different knowledge systems, I would say, and that would really be helpful to open up the scope of this discussion.
And maybe one last question, if we could do a round. What's the one thing we need to do for better risk governance of gene-edited crops, or better governance in the future? What is your vision for this going forward? And then we'll stop with that. So let's see, who's ready? Who wants to start?
Well, one of the things for me, speaking for the Global South, it's how are we not just consumers, but producers of technologies that are benefiting what we see are the most urgent, pressing needs. So part of it, the dynamics is not being a passive player, being active at the innovation level, being active at the policy and regulatory level, so that the engagement can really be an engagement that is an equitable partnership, participatory engagement.
Great.
I would come back to what I said earlier, which is I think we should look at the technology and different applications of the technology. So not talk about it in a uniform way, an homologous way, but look at it as it's segmented based on the kinds of products it can apply, and look at, is there a potential risk? And if there's such, is there a risk that we should be managing in some way through regulation? And I think I think we've made a mistake by saying, is this a GMO or is this a conventional product? We put a dichotomy out there, and that's not a good way to look at this. I think we should look at that. The other thing is, I know there are a bunch of questions people have asked about, do consumers have a right to this information or that information and things like that? I think consumers want the information they want to know, whatever that is. They don't want people to tell them what information they should have. If they are interested in information, that's what should be available to them. And so I think that's something to keep in mind also. And Sarah or the food manufacturers would clearly say consumers want whatever information they want. Maybe it may not be science-based. It may not be what you think they should have. But if they want it, it's important to them. And that's what the market's going to address.
Sarah? Yeah, Greg, just following up on that, I think when I think about the vision for moving forward with all of this, it's how are we ensuring that we're having the right kind of dialogues to build trust, but that also when we're learning from one another during those dialogues, that then we're fulfilling our obligations to one another. So if we're listening to the consumers, as Greg mentioned, and we're learning what they want and we're able to provide that information, then how are the consumers acting in return? I think that's something that that we have a lot to learn about. But if we can all come together and realize that our values are aligned and that this technology is a great tool in order to be able to achieve some of our common goals, then how are we moving forward together to ensure that the system is working?
Great. And Salim, the last word.
Yeah, so yeah, thank you. And for me, I would be a bit provocative here, and I would say that by contrast to the idea of science-based decision, I think I would rather push for political-based science, in a sense of having more, again, democracy in science. And it's clear that the policy and political dimension is usually seen as a kind of dirty business, something that impact robustness and impartiality that is needed for science. But the way I understand it, it's more for scientists to be more, to pay more attention to the context, to pay more attention to the diversity of knowledge system, and to pay more attention to the consequence of its work. So it's more that those three dimensions that are important to consider.
Wonderful.
And to
well, I want to
bring
thank
in
all of you on the panel so
daily
much.
work
You did a
of
great job
scientists.
of answering the questions and being engaged. So thank you. And thank all of you for attending, and make sure to check out the expo space. And I want to thank Keystone again. And I hope that we can continue these very productive and important dialogues about gene edited plants and food products. So thank you very much. Julie?
All right. Yeah, echoing the thanks and extending it as well to Jennifer, along with Eliane, Sarah, Greg, and Salim. Really appreciate the conversation today. And we hope you'll stick around, as now we'll be transitioning to our Ideas Marketplace. In the Sessions tab on the left-hand side of your screen, you can click on that button and choose a session. We have 2 today that we'll each be exploring in different ways. A continuation of the conversation on gene editing, agriculture, and governance of risks and benefits. Up to 20 people can join the discussion with video and audio. So we hope you'll click on that, share your screens, and participate yourselves in the conversation. And thank you to our audience for participating all along today. Again, thanks to the Genetic Engineering and Society Center at North Carolina State University, Jennifer and her colleagues, Patty, Katie, and others for your leadership and in-kind partnership this week. And thanks to our sponsors, as well as all of our CRISPR-Con advisors listed at CRISPRcon.org. Thanks as well to the audience, and I hope you'll tune in on Thursday as well for our next session. It'll be 3 p.m. Eastern and focusing on intersections of conservation, climate justice, and gene editing. Today's session will be available on our CRISPR-Con YouTube channel within 24 hours, as are all of our past sessions. So please feel free to go back and check out today's content and also content that you may have missed earlier this year or in past years. That concludes our live content for today. Hope to see most of you in the sessions section for our Ideas Marketplace, and also continue the dialogue on Twitter at #CRISPRcon2020. Register for future events. We have 1 more week coming up at the end of this month, focused on priority and agenda setting. And you can also, again, visit our expo at any time between now and the close of programming on Thursday. Thanks again. Please carry on the conversation.